Mars. I keep hearing all these neat things about it, but how would we get there?
Okay, students, come on, let's gather around. Come on, boys. Just gather in. Okay, are there any questions so far?
Yeah, I have a big one. What we've been talking about is kind of interesting, but how will we get there?
Well, good question, and one that should be asked before going on any trip. But before we answer the question of how will we get there, let's take a moment and think about how Dr. Walker got to Kentucky.
I bet you didn't take a plane.
I'll agree with you, Alex. No planes, trains, or automobiles on that trip.
I think that he probably rode on a horse.
And you're absolutely right.
I left my house in Louisa County, Virginia on the 6th day of March, 1750 at 10 o'clock in the morning with my 5 fellow explorers. Each of us had a horse, and we had 2 more to carry the baggage. Initially, as we traveled toward Kentucky, we stayed at homes of people that were on the route we were taking. As we got further into our journey, we set up camps for the night. Our entire journey took 129 days, a little over 4 months, but that was still a shorter trip than the one that you might find yourself on as you journey to Mars. And of course, that won't be on horses, although who knows? One of the space shuttles might be named Old Nellie.
Students, if you were on a mission to Mars, do you suppose there's a particular time period when launching from Earth should take place?
Does it have to do with the orbits and how close they get to each other?
That's exactly right. In the planetary orbits, when Mars is at the closest to Earth, it's called favorable opposition.
So how close is it when it's close?
Only 35 million miles.
Only? So how far is it when it's not close?
It's about 7 times further away, so 250 million miles.
Well, that makes 35 million miles seem close.
Mason?
Did Dr. Walker have to worry about favorable opposition?
Well, something like that. I think that seasonal climate conditions were a factor he had to consider when planning his trip.
If you notice the dates of my trip, you'll see that I left March 6th and arrived back home on July 13th. I made the journey then so that we wouldn't have to travel in too much snow, and we could get back before those really hot days that usually come during the end of July and August. I guess that you could call that planning for a trip during my favorable opposition.
Okay, let's imagine we're on a spaceship. What do you think we might encounter?
Maybe a whole lot of space.
Well, a whole lot of space, but what else might we encounter on our journey?
We might come across some comets and asteroids and maybe even some space junk that's already up there. I hope we go past them and not into them. That wouldn't be good.
No, it wouldn't. And that's part of all of the planning. There could be some parts of the trip that deals with space or solar winds.
You know what I think?
What's that?
I think that Dr. Walker probably had an easier trip to plan than the one going to Mars.
And I think you're probably right.
Although it is true that there are a lot more complicated things to consider when planning a trip to Mars, the trip that I planned had its share of difficulties. Of course, on a Mars trip, all the food, clothing, and other supplies will have to be carried on board the spaceship. You won't be able to stop and buy things. And let me tell you about a few other problems we encountered along the way. Sometimes our horses would wander off and we would have to look for them. One time, it took a whole day before we found them. We crossed the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky on April 13th, and 6 days later, Ambrose Powell, one of my companions, was bit by a bear in his knee. To top that off, on May 6th, Ambrose sprained his good knee. One night, wolves kept circling our camp and howling all night, even after we shot at them. At different times in April, May, and June, while our horses were eating, 3 of them got bitten in the nose by poisonous snakes. So you see, we had a lot of things to overcome too.
I've got a question.
And what's that?
Did Dr. Walker explore at the same time as Lewis and Clark?
Good question. And the answer is no. Lewis and Clark expedition happened about 50 years later. But I'm glad that you asked, because Lewis and Clark are actually a good example of how we humans like to explore new territories and how we have to plan for those explorations.
Last year, my parents took my sisters and me on a trip to Washington, D.C. We went to the Smithsonian Institute and saw an exhibit on the Lewis and Clark expedition. I remember them having a couple of times where their weapons and horses were stolen from them.
You know, and things like that happen. All explorers and adventurers have things that they could plan for on their trip, and then they have to do their very best to be prepared for the unexpected things that they might encounter. That was true of Lewis and Clark, Dr. Walker, Daniel Boone, Christopher Columbus, and Admiral Richard Byrd, who explored the Arctic and Antarctic regions. Why, even Neil Armstrong on the moon, and James Lovell Jr. and other Apollo mission members.
Christopher Columbus? He didn't have to worry about any horses stolen, did he?
No, I don't think that he had to worry about anything like that.
Just wondering.
I've got a question. When Dr. Walker made his trip and had problems, he was still on Earth. Isn't it easier to figure what to do down here than when traveling up there in a spaceship?
Oh yes, and that's why we have to do a lot of planning, checking, and double checking. And that's why it's important for people like you students to know what could go wrong and figure out how to keep it from happening. After all, remember, it's your generation that could be the ones going to Mars.
That sounds a bit scary.
Not me. It sounds like an adventure.
Yeah, like a challenge. And a whole lot of work.
Scary, adventure, challenges, and work. Those are all words that belong in the vocabulary of an explorer. And yet we realize that there has to be a balance in life. It can't be all scary, and it can't be all work. And you know, speaking of work, in your world today, sometimes you may get so used to getting things quickly that you forget some of the work that other people do behind the scenes. Take a meal, for example. Now let's think about a meal. You see, on my trip, my companions and I, well, we had to kill an animal and then either skin it or pluck the feathers off, prepare it, and then cook it. Now, I understand that some of you may get just a little bit impatient if you have to wait 2 or 3 minutes at the drive-thru line at McDonald's. But think about it. That's a whole meal that you're waiting on. Something that would take my companions and I sometimes hours to prepare. And another question you'll have to ask as far as how do I prepare is what kinds of preparations as a person will I need to make? Now, my 35 years of life before I made my 1750 expedition was interesting. I was a doctor and in the real estate and importing business with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and others. I was a farmer, a builder, a land surveyor, and a civil engineer. And I was also hardworking and honest and able to work well with others. And all these things served me well on my trip. Now you need to prepare too. I'm going to paraphrase a president that came after my time, James A. Garfield.
Realize, as you observe people and life, that education is the key to unlocking many of opportunity's doors.
Now also, along with doing well in school, you have to show personal responsibility, be able to function well as a member of a team, and you should live a healthy life, eat right, exercise, get enough sleep. Ask any astronaut and he or she will tell you that this is important. And something else that you might need to realize, sometimes in school there may be a subject that you say, I don't really like it all that much. Well, something to think about, whether it's giving a speech or math or history. You don't have to like it, you just have to do it. And the interesting thing is, sometimes as you're doing it, then you start to find out that you're beginning to like it. That's not only true of subjects, sometimes it can be true of people or teachers that you think that you may not like that much. And all these things I found to be true many times in my life. Now that I think about it, I'd be a good astronaut.